SpaceX's stock isn't the only thing going down this week as they launch Starfall. While Rocket Lab is busy launching all sorts of satellites, SpaceX sends up yeast in their effort to develop beer that can survive on Mars.
Sláinte to Ubatica as they raise money along with a handful of other satellite operators this week. Applications across the board on imaging, maritime services, and orbital data centers are seeing growth demand as multiple sectors are growing the space industry.
It's a battle of the giants as the US and Canada compete to fund the most expensive satellites. Satellite servicing companies fight to shift this paradigm, but it'll take a lot of effort to bring down these behemoth contracts.
Welcome to this week's episode of Space Times Podcast. As always, I'm Paul Mayer.
Here with Harrison Lambert.
Excited to share this week's space industry updates with you. We hope you enjoy the episode. Subscribe to our newsletter if you want the written breakdown of our episodes emailed to your inbox every Monday morning. Drop us a comment on our LinkedIn or Blue Sky with anything you enjoyed or would like to see. And as always, listen weekly on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Substack, or wherever you're receiving this signal.
This week's main topics include launch, spacecraft, and infrastructure. To start things off, we have rockets firing on all cylinders. We've got Rocket Lab with two big updates this week. Initially, their launch of Victus Haze. This is a rapid response satellite mission. They had a notice to launch timeline of 16 hours and 42 minutes, which is an amazing turnaround for a space mission. So this is the second of the Victus Haze missions. There was a Victus Nox mission as well. And originally Firefly was intended to be the rocket provider. But given the pause on the Alpha rocket, the USSF decided to shift over to Rocket Lab and launch the True Anomaly Jackal out of New Zealand to meet up with a previous Jackal that was pre-deployed on SpaceX's, I believe, Transporter 15. That was already pre-deployed. So this Jackal is meant to go up and tag up with that other Jackal in a demonstration of the ability to rapidly deploy a satellite that can go intercept another satellite, and ideally a satellite that puts up a fight against being captured. So this is a whole sort of simulation by the USSF government to demonstrate their ability to rapidly respond to on-orbit threats from adversarial satellites. And so far, it seems to be going off without a hitch. That's a rapid turnaround. Jackal's previously shown its ability to do rendezvous proximity operations, so a very capable satellite. Altogether, it makes for a very impressive system that the United States Defense Agency is able to wield to address some of the growing concerns they've had about, the contested nature of space.
Yeah, I think the 16-hour 42, we'll call it 16 and a half hours. But the 16 and a half hour notice to launch, I think that beats the previous record by 10 hours or something like that. I think the previous record was closer to 28 hours. But just lightning fast deployment that we've seen from Rocket Lab. I'd be curious as to how cold the notice actually was. For example, Firefly was initially supposed to be the recipient of this contract. They were supposed to be the ones to provide the vehicle, but given the delay to their Alpha, the U.S. Space Force had to go with somebody else. So I would imagine that Rocket Lab had known basically since then that this contract was sort of in the books and that this was coming, and that this wasn't a, CEO gets a call in the middle of the night on sort of the red colored hardline phone, with the little rotating dial there. But I would imagine that Rocket Lab had a lot of sort of notice that, hey, at some point we're going to get a call and we're going to need to turn things around as fast as possible. So I'd be curious as to how much of that is actually repeatable. But I mean, regardless, who cares how much of it is repeatable? 16 and a half hours is fabulous. That's a massive proof of capability for rapid response, especially for a vehicle that's intended to conduct RPO and more, I won't say space-based interceptions, but in so many words, that's intended to get up there and immediately provide support or protection for assets that are currently on orbit. I'd read also that Rocket Lab that this not only demonstrated the rapid turnaround, but that they'd been able to go effectively end to end with this, representing sort of the first time that a prime had been able to do everything for a TAC RS mission, where previously there needed to be sort of multiple contractors involved, which is great for certain situations, but for immediate response, needing to call multiple cooks is just going to slow things down. So really impressive week from Rocket Lab for sure.
Yeah, I actually misspoke. So the spacecraft they launched was not True Anomaly's Jackal. True Anomaly is the other one that participates in the Victus Hayes mission, but this was actually Rocket Lab's own vehicle, the Pioneer, which they titled this spacecraft in particular the Puma. Which I don't know if that's like a in competition with the Jackal, like dog and cat fight up in space, but it's pretty cool. Pretty cool to have a space provider that can do end-to-end responsive space capability like this, to have the rocket and the spacecraft as well. But I believe that it's meant to go up and interact with True Anomaly's Jackal 4 as the target, and that was launched previously on a SpaceX rideshare mission.
I mean, Rocket Lab, you mentioned that they had a couple of wins. I know that they also got some NASA contracts, and I haven't seen any sort of valuation or the size of either their NASA contract or the Victus Hayes launch contract, but I'd imagine that the sizes are sort of reflective of the magnitude of the capabilities that have been proven out. I would imagine that the Victus Hayes mission had a much bigger price tag on it than what we're about to talk about. But two big wins on the book for Rocket Lab, nonetheless.
It's good that they're getting both. I think historically they've done a lot of like governmental launches, but more on the civil side of things. So, like they had their 8th Synspective launch or something this week as well, which at this point we've kind of stopped reporting on because they have so many of them. But they've also won the launches for 3 NASA satellites, which, like you noted, is probably worth less than a DoD kind of contract, and the implications are probably a smaller scale, as the DoD is spending a lot of money to stand up capabilities like Victus Hayes, whereas NASA kind of gives one-off contracts for satellites. But these are still, a group of contracts that's really impressive for Rocket Lab, and I think they keep winning these government contracts because they're such a reliable launch provider. But this week they got 3 Electron launches, 1 for Pulsar and 2 for TSIS, which are Sun-Earth science missions. So the Pulsar is meant to measure ice in tropical regions on the Earth, and the TSIS missions are meant to study Sun-Earth weather in space. So, we've seen some similar NASA contracts for this sort of stuff go out recently, which I just see as a good sign, seeing as how NASA has kind of reduced their funding and typically pull away from these sort of contracts. But to see that satellites like this are still going up is great. And NASA was a huge boon for SpaceX's launch program early in their lifetime. So it's good to see them continuing to support launch vehicle providers as they continue to grow, such as with Rocket Lab, who's working hard towards getting their Neutron to launch. Speaking of SpaceX had a very unique sort of mission happen this week. We mentioned it a couple of weeks ago when they filed with the FAA to do Starfall, which is a spacecraft that does kind of the opposite of what they typically do. It is a return to Earth vehicle. So they are taking kind of the shell of a Dragon vehicle and just using it to capture materials that are either put on orbit or manufactured on orbit and then return it to Earth. I was very surprised to see that they actually launched it this week, seeing as how they only filed a couple of weeks ago, and that was the first sign that they were serious about this. There had been kind of rumors about it for a while, but that filing was the first indication that they're actually going to pursue this, and for them to so quickly turn around and actually launch something is impressive. This one has the payload of Starbase Brewing, which they called the Microbrew 2 mission. And Paul, you want to have any guesses as to what kind of beer they might have launched on this spacecraft?
I've got many, but I'd probably go with something like the Lagrange Lager, or maybe Red Dwarf Ale, or the Milky Way Stout, or the Pale Blue Ale, or the I think what I might be most proud of is the Sat Ale Light.
I like that one.
Those all seem like good options for me, but I do admit it's pretty ale heavy.
Yeah, yeah. No polar orbit Pilsner here.
Not yet, not yet.
Got a number of options. We'll have to see if any of those come true. Yeah, it sounds like a dozen or so different types of yeast that they're testing on orbit. So definitely an interesting use case for in space hosting of materials. It's not quite the manufacturing application, but seeing as how this is their first launch, it's a fun use for this mission.
Yeah, it's a fun payload.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, how it performs. It hasn't returned to Earth yet, so we'll be keeping an eye on it. But if they're able to successfully launch and land a payload like that, it kind of shakes up the in-space manufacturing sector of our industry in a big way. It's a sector we've talked about a lot, and we've talked to some leaders of companies working on this sort of thing. And it's
space manufacturing and space logistics as well.
Yeah, and it's an industry a lot of people are very excited to see manifest because it has a large price tag projected to be attached to it, but it's just been one that's very slow to materialize. So, my hope is that this demonstration mission doesn't so much kill the competitors as much as it validates the market and kind of opens it up to the growth that we've been hearing about for quite a while now.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I hope for the same that this proves to be more of a net boon for space logistics, down mass and on orbit manufacturing. From a strategy perspective, this is not something that SpaceX would have whipped up over a long weekend. You know what I mean? Like this is an effort, and this is something that they would have been working on for an extended period of time. Maybe not order of magnitude years, but order of magnitude months.
Yeah.
So let's just number from a hat. Let's just say 6 months. I do not understand why they would have done this in secret or so close to the vest. Because, SpaceX owns upmass for the most part. If they want to get into downmass, they probably want to get into downmass either to try and grow into a revenue earning business line. Most of SpaceX's business lines are operating at a net loss. Currently, sort of Starlink / Starshield is the only net operating revenue generating company or aspect of the company. So I don't understand why they would be coy or play this close to the vest if they think that this is something that can help them net earn revenues. They are positioned, they're big enough, they're vertically integrated enough, they have enough competitive advantage where they would be able to effectively say, we're going to go for this market. And because the market is so nascent, because there's no incumbents and there's effectively no competition in the market, anybody else, any VC or investor or startup would effectively need to be betting against SpaceX. Either, that SpaceX isn't going to win everything, or that, we're going to somehow do this better than SpaceX. I mean, obviously that's not going to happen. So it's going to boil down to more of sort of a market share where SpaceX is going to do cost leadership. They're going to have the most competitive price point. Nobody else is going to be able to compete with that. But this other company or this third company, but other companies are going to be able to provide some sort of tailored or differentiated service or product that costs a little bit more money, but there's going to be customers who would prefer that, right? Like much in the same way that SpaceX, nobody's going to be able to compete with SpaceX on launch cost at this point, but everybody else who's providing launch is still in business in large part because there's so much demand that, hey, you'll get just my asset up there, even though it costs me 2 or 3 times as much. Great, sold. So I don't understand the decision to sort of keep all of this close to the vest. I don't get it. But we'll just have to see. This is clearly sort of early stage. They got a fun payload that they're running up with this, and this is just their first demo and their first launch of it. So we'll have to see what this actually sort of materializes into. But I cannot understand why they would choose to do this quietly. But I don't know. I'd love your thoughts on it if you have any.
surprise payload from orbit. It's the shock and awe campaign. Yeah, I don't know. It is weird that they've kind of kept it so secretive. Maybe it's just a focus thing. Like they have been getting more playful with their business recently, and maybe that's a lax term for what they've been up to, especially with all the AI kind of efforts that they've been working on. But for the longest time, it's been launch and Starlink. Like that's been their business. But now they're talking about Starfall. They're talking about AI. They've got their moon efforts. They're talking about like railguns on Earth. They're talking about TerraFab. Got Star Mine, which is their AI stuff. They've got what is it? Star. They have something else. They're talking about like mobile company and things. So yeah, I just see it as like they now have the capital and the capability to start expanding into other more I don't know how to say, like aspirational businesses, the ones that don't really have an existing kind of basis for them to lean on. Like launch was already a thing before Falcon. Telecoms was already a thing before Starlink. They were able to take that and revolutionize it, but there is no in-space manufacturing industry. The ISS is the only one that does it, and it's not a commercial entity. So they are this to me is their first time creating a commercial business from whole cloth, and I don't think they had the kind of room to do that until they went and IPO'd.
Well, I mean, you are correct that they are, talking about a lot of more aspirational or fun or, I'll say like less immediate markets and products and solutions. I mean, that's great if you're a privately held company and, that's what you want to do. But now as a publicly held company, you can't operate like a privately held company chasing whatever seems fun at the time, like chasing whatever goal is the goal of the moment, despite the fact that they raised, what was it, 77 billion in the IPO.
Yeah.
They've got a massive war chest of fresh capital burning holes in their pockets. And it does sound like the plan is to just sort of do a little bit of everything and see what sticks. But that's, I mean, spaghetti on the wall is not great to see at the, late stage corporate level where you have companies this big deploying capital inefficiently. For companies at this size, you generally like to see them with a little bit more debt because that, in so many words, that requires and demands a higher level of fiscal responsibility than sort of getting a big pool of money and pursuing a bunch of different projects that seem fun. So, they're going to have to now publicly announce the strategy and the vision, and they're going to have to make that story convincing, and they're going to have to be really consistent with it now. So I don't know. I'm getting visions of empire building from some of the stated markets and target industries that they're focusing on. Which is always an inefficient way to deploy capital. Maybe there's an exception or two to the rule out there, but it never goes as well as anybody wants it to. And so I don't know. SpaceX now has a responsibility to effectively the public, as a publicly traded company who is invested in by public securities and invested in by retirement funds and what have you. Like the list of folks to whom SpaceX now owes is now to be held responsible has grown exponentially. So I would hope that there is more planning and more of a cohesive vision going on than sort of just spaghetti on the wall.
I'm curious to see what ends up making them the most money because, this competes with a lot of in-space manufacturing, but it also competes with the likes of inversion, where they want to store stuff on orbit and then bring it down in a moment's notice. I could see them taking a defense play with this, where it's on orbit logistics for things like naval fleets or for deployed platoons. That could certainly have more money attached to it, at least in the short to medium term, than something like in space manufacturing. And there's nothing really that precludes them from doing both. So it's just going to be interesting to see which one they kind of lean more heavily into. For other launch companies, we have Firefly Aerospace acquiring Space NG this week. That's Space-NG. This is a space autonomy company. They provided the vision-based navigation solutions for the Blue Ghost lander that Firefly flew. That sounded weird. Firefly flew. Fire flew a couple years ago. That's the only commercial moon lander to successfully land on the moon. So a huge endorsement of Space NG's capability. Of course, a lot goes, to be said for Firefly's engineering capability, but the fact that they are willing to buy this company to enhance their future endeavors with moon efforts is very telling. They recently won the Elytra orbital vehicle as part of a lunar contract win. And so it's likely that they're looking to in-house some of these capabilities to further capitalize upon this kind of growing lunar momentum that they have for their business. And I think it comes at a conspicuous time for a lot of these launch companies. Rocket Lab has plenty of planetary missions that they fly to the moon, to Mars, to other planets. Relativity Space just got their Mars planetary science contract. SpaceX is focused on the moon right now. So it seems that Firefly is making their play to also stay focused on the moon, but potentially more in line with some of these NASA lunar contracts and some of the USSF lunar security contracts is how I kind of read this acquisition.
Yeah, I think this is definitely in Firefly's attempts or best interests to maintain a meaningful stake in the lunar missions, the lunar-based lunar economy, cislunar layer of orbital assets that we're sort of expecting to see coming. I think the fact that they've already sort of flown together and they've already worked together on the Blue Ghost Lander 1, I think that is a pretty revealing tack that they already sort of have that relationship and are comfortable sort of moving forward together.
Yeah.
But one thing that I thought was really interesting is that, so this deal not publicly disclosed for the most part in any capacity. There's no valuation, there's no terms announced. This is sort of happening behind closed doors. And the announcement out of Firefly claims that Space NG will be fully integrated into Firefly, which to me reads much more like a Firefly is fully absorbing, fully eating Space NG in so many words. So it's not so much partners. There's a very clear ownership, like I own you.
Yeah.
And that level of integration is much more consistent with scale acquisitions than scope acquisitions. Again, top level of scale acquisition is when I'm going to go ahead and buy multiple companies that basically do the same thing, and then I'm going to cut as many sort of redundant costs as I can. So I'm going to, buy up 5 or 6 of the same company or 100 of the same company, consolidate HR, consolidate operations, consolidate, and just cut costs everywhere I can. Scale acquisitions are generally about cutting costs and achieving some sort of operational savings. Scope acquisitions, on the other hand, are much more about growing revenues. And so for multiple reasons, this reads like the strategy for this aligns with the scope acquisition. Like Firefly is buying Space NG because they want and need Space NG's optical and automated navigation solutions.
Yeah.
But the fact that they're ingesting them like a scale acquisition indicates that, maybe they read a different textbook at business school, or maybe they think that they're not actually starting from scratch. So maybe Firefly thinks that they have that this is something that they've been working on. And so Firefly's perspective is, hey, this isn't actually a scope acquisition. We're not buying capability that we don't have in-house. We are supplementing our own existing capability. So if they feel that they have their own vision-based navigation solutions and they have their own sort of technology stack and they have their own capabilities and they need to supplement that, then in this case, that would align a little bit more with a scale acquisition. So, we'll just sort of have to see where things wind up going. At first blush, my read on this situation, my read on Firefly buying SpaceNG is that Firefly either thinks that they are better at automatic space-based vision-based navigation than maybe an outsider would, or that they maybe have sort of not like by any means intentionally, or that they've sort of presented this thing and it just reads like a scale acquisition when it's actually intended to be a scope acquisition. But if Firefly is intentionally planning on fully absorbing, cutting costs, saving synergies, they would only be doing so if they thought that SpaceNG's technical capabilities were sort of on par or comparable to their own in the vision-based navigation. So this could very well go super well if everybody's aligned it on the same page. But if there's sort of a mismatch there, and if Firefly thinks that they are on par with SpaceNG's vision-based navigation, when in reality they only have 10% of that capability, they could be setting themselves up for a really difficult road ahead.
On to Spacecraft, we have Sophia Space raising a $7 million SAFE round. This is to partner with Apex Space on developing an orbital compute demo. This brings their total funding to $22 million after they raised a seed round, I believe, back in February. So interesting to see a few smaller rounds of funding to kind of get their technology deployed. Sophia Space has a pretty novel approach to orbital data centers. Their compute layer is sandwiched between the solar layer and the thermal rejection layer, which makes for a very kind of compact package that I have some doubts about technically, but that's why I'm more curious than ever to see how it performs on orbit. They recently partnered with Kepler Space to integrate their solution into Kepler Tranche 2, which I found interesting given that Kepler was already partnered with Axiom Space for their orbital data centers. But orbital compute is one of the key kind of capabilities that Kepler is marketing for some of their hosted payload programs. So that made a lot of sense to me. The Apex one makes a little less sense to me. Apex has talked about doing orbital data centers. They had their Comet Plus or XL platform they announced a couple months ago. That was to develop a satellite that's up to 100 kilowatts of power, which is about the power size that we've been seeing for a lot of orbital data center class satellites. But Apex kind of develops their own package, and the whole benefit of Sophia Space is that it kind of integrates well into the solar panel portion of a spacecraft and doesn't require any modification to the core bus of it. So what I'm a little curious to see here is that, if they actually go forward with this partnership and they, Apex is a supplier for Sophia, it feels like a lot of wasted space on the main payload deck for this solution. But what would be interesting to me is that in the case that it effectively doubles the ability to do orbital compute, if Sophia Space is able to operate their panel-based kind of solution in a nominal case, and then any additional energy any additional power gets redirected to the payload deck, where maybe they add additional orbital compute nodes, or maybe some other alternative hosted payloads can leverage the excess power. But I guess it's something I'd like to understand more about Sophia's solution, just in terms of how it it's a really neat kind of trick to fit onto basically any spacecraft. I just don't see how it benefits spacecraft that are already being designed to be orbital data center platforms.
Yeah, I'm kind of in agreement with you. Like, so Sophia Space's primary value add is the fact that they have designed basically a stacked satellite. So flat stack, you've got basically a panel of plywood with on one side of it is your solar cell. In the middle of the plywood is the actual compute layer, and then on the back end is your radiator. So like that is their tile approach. That is their thermal integrated LEO edge compute module. And so, Apex represents a satellite, like a bus manufacturer and a bus platform that has already been designed for more traditional payloads. And so like it's unclear whether from what I could see, whether the architecture assumed that the tiles would be part of the payload or would be basically part of the solar array and part of the solar solution. Either way, I'm sure that this is sort of an early on relationship, and I'm sure that they will sort of arrive. What the stated intent today will probably look a little bit different than what's actually delivered and shipped in 2027 for their demo mission. But the Nova satellite platform, I know, is something that for the most part has already existed. So it kind of reads a little bit more like this is a more of a demonstration than it is meant to be something that's like mass manufacturable or able to achieve sort of scale. But we'll have to see. I can only imagine that if the tile modules are able to perform really well, that Apex and Sophia will find a way to achieve success together. Because they already have the relationship, because Apex is going to be able to produce at massive scale, and because Sophia's technology has some sort of gaps in their current performance on orbit. Like I'd imagine that sort of if the heritage data all looks good and if everything winds up coming up aces here, that this will work out super well. But it does seem a little bit rough around the edges, to your point.
Yeah, I mean, to look at it as a demo mission makes it make a little more sense. Like you said, the Nova class is much more developed than the Comet class from Apex. And I think the other thing to note is that this safe round was led by Evergreen and NVIDIA's Alumni Investment Network. So not directly NVIDIA, but kind of tied to NVIDIA, which they've previously announced they're using NVIDIA's Blackwell chips in their tile architecture. So interesting to see some connection here, in that it might be helping to do early like proof of concept for NVIDIA's AI chips before they get deployed to these larger scale orbital data centers. Because I think orbital data centers are early. Nobody's really deployed them at scale, and this sort of architecture is early. Like it's not something that historically a lot of satellites have done. These tile type scalable architectures.
Right.
The Starlink is kind of the notable forerunner of this, but even they're not purely tile. It's more like tile packaged. But once they deploy, they're basically a full satellite. We have seen it with companies like Virtus Solis or the Meridian constellation at a spin launch, or Rendezvous Robotics approach, which is these tile kind of assemblable structures on orbit. And it's something a lot of people have been pushing for. Like Aerospace Labs has the DiskSat concept. So there does seem to be this concerted push towards a more like flat pack, assemblable tile-based structure. But if you'll note, like none of those companies are deploying at scale yet. So there's not really been any proof of concept that this architectural work at the scales people are talking about, or at the scales that an orbital data center needs. So I think it's proving a few different things. Or it's proving orbital data centers, NVIDIA chips work, and it's proving out this tile structure, which both are going to be interesting demos to watch the results of. Onto our favorite company, Vantor. They've announced a partnership with BAE to manufacture their Vantage platform. This is a very interesting development, as we talked about it a few months ago when they unveiled the Vantage platform, which is based on their Legion platform, which I worked on like 6 years ago now, 5-6 years ago now. And that was originally developed to be like the the SSL Maxar 500 bus, and it was for high resolution imaging platforms. So now they've kind of broken it out into the Vantage platform. And given that they spent 5-6 years developing this internally as Maxar when they were both Vantor and Lanteris together, it is quite odd to see them kind of ditch their other half and go to this completely separate manufacturer. It's not surprising that Intuitive Machines wouldn't want to keep manufacturing this. It's not in their wheelhouse and it doesn't benefit their lunar aspirations. But to me, it is surprising that Vantor would want to switch suppliers after investing so heavily in being able to manufacture this themselves. To their credit, BAE is a great company. I'm sure they'll be capable of manufacturing this and at scale cost effectively. So
Sure.
it makes sense they would go to BAE. It's just surprising after all of the work they did to get this platform developed in-house that they would then go and outsource the manufacture of it.
Yeah, I had a good laugh at this. There's a lot of history between Space Systems Loral and Ball Aerospace. Ball Aerospace, also out of Colorado, close by to Digital Globe. Digital Globe and Space Systems Loral were sort of two of the key participants in Maxar Technologies, along with MDA Space. BAE Systems eventually acquired Ball Aerospace as part of their much broader sort of suite of capabilities. So I am choosing to believe, and I have absolutely no justification for this, but I am choosing to believe that Ball Aerospace, the same company that held poached as many people from Space Systems Loral as they possibly could shortly after we merged and became Maxar. I'm choosing to believe that Ball Aerospace is the ones that Vantor has wound up contracting to because of whatever sort of hurdles or difficulties they experienced in solving these capabilities in-house.
Yeah, I also find it odd that they only mentioned the Vantage platform, seeing as how they announced Vantage and Pulse like a couple months ago. So I don't know if that means Pulse is still being manufactured in-house or by Lanteris. They're pretty similar platforms. Vantage is like 20 centimeter resolution, which is higher than the Worldview Legion, but Pulse is 40 centimeters, which is lower than the Legion resolution. So
Legion is 30 or 35?
It's 30. It can go lower, but it operates currently at 30. So it's weird. I mean, maybe they're going to continue to manufacture Pulse. I mean, it may seem like a small distinction between 40 and 20 centimeters, but those are world apart when it comes to like designing a satellite. So perhaps it's that they don't need BAE's expertise with imagery to manufacture the Pulse spacecraft. Or maybe they're seeing more demand for Vantage after they announced it, and they just need the support of a bigger manufacturer to get, to meet demand. So either there's a benefit to not manufacturing them both, which there are a number of benefits, right? Like you're not supplier locked. They're different kind of manufacturing procedures. They're fundamentally different spacecraft. But also maybe they just like when they announced both, they only saw demand for one because, like to your point, Pulse is something a lot of companies know how to do. Vantage, they'd be cutting edge.
I'm willing to bet that the demand and more importantly the margins on the differentiated the 20 centimeter resolution is enough to make that a much higher priority than the lower margin, more commoditized 40 centimeter resolution, that in order to see the same sort of bottom line, the sheer volume would have to increase drastically. It's a little bit odd to see. Vantor working so hard to effectively divest themselves from the hardware space and focus on the digital layer, and then sort of change course a little bit and try to maintain some of the hardware manufacturing and try to, as to your point, as Maxar, try to maintain and keep this in-house, and then divest of all their manufacturing capabilities and now need to hire out to who traditionally has been their biggest competitor.
Yeah, when it comes to manufacturing, yeah. On the communication side of things, we have Reorbit launching their Orbit Cloud R&D with a $4.6 million grant from Business Finland. So Reorbit is a micro geo manufacturer out of Finland. They've had some interesting traction so far. They're one of the earlier or like more recent kind of developed companies between like Swiss 12 and Ascendarc and Astranis. But they've seen a lot of good traction for their platform, particularly creating the cloud infrastructure for Google's orbital data center play. They won that late last year. It was a pretty big deal, seeing as how Planet was the other one that won a Google contract to actually develop the orbital data centers, and Reorbit would be kind of the communication layer to connect all of those orbital data center compute nodes. So it seems like they are pushing further into this kind of connected communication layer system that they've got traction with Google through. It's interesting to see because companies like Astranis, I feel like they're getting a lot of their traction through government, like isolated communication satellites. So point-to-point communication and, military grade communication, those kind of systems that are very closed ecosystem, whereas Reorbit is looking at something that's a bit more broad. And same with like Swiss to 12 and the Ascendarc. Like a lot of the contracts I see them selling are for individual nations that want to buy their own micro geo satellite. But it seems like Reorbit is positioning much more towards a connected kind of ecosystem of communication, much more like we see with proliferated communication systems. And I think it puts them a little more head to head with some of the stalwart communication geocom providers like Viasat or SES that have that kind of already deployed system of satellites that they're able to kind of leverage to create a more unique, more connected system. But I think it's a smart play by Reorbit, especially if they're able to get this kind of money to actually develop it. Over to Paul's favorite country, Ireland. Startup Ubotica Technologies has raised $11 million to accelerate the commercial deployment of their AI-powered intelligence platform to expand their live maritime intelligence service. So this is a use case that doesn't get talked about a whole lot for the size of it. It's not the most sexy kind of use case. I feel like a lot of people don't talk about boats, even though they make up a large section of business for communications and Earth imaging applications. So, there's a few companies that are very focused on it. We have companies like Spire that are quite big, but again, not talked about often. But a lot of their money comes from maritime intelligence capabilities. So to see another company like this being able to raise so much money to develop a technology means there's still some room to grow here. And especially, leveraging that AI-powered intelligence at the edge is one of these increasing trends we're seeing across a lot of imaging and communications imaging companies and like communications on the side of ISR, so intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance applications. So companies that receive radio signals from the ground and then process it to try to gain intelligence, which is what Spire does. There's other companies like Unseen Labs that we've talked about recently. There's companies like Tomorrow.io. They got funding for their AI at the edge processing of radio signals as well. So it's a trend we see increasing. It's cool to see another company that's being able to pursue this. Means that there's still some room to grow here and benefit maritime industry.
Most common application of Earth observation that I saw was actually in the maritime industry on the investment side of things. There were a lot of companies that were looking at taking intelligence, taking Earth observation specifically to identify dark vessels that are trying to avoid sanctions, all in the interest of national security. Now, obviously, that will have shifted over the past several years and months as the domain of conflict has shifted more from surreptitious shipping practices to direct armed conflict. But maritime tracking is and always has been one of the bigger priorities and one of the bigger challenges with Earth observation. So it's interesting to see another company basically making a play to improve and bring AI streamlining to that space. There's a lot of companies that are sort of trying to do that, but it's great to see more players enter the market for sure.
Lastly, for Spacecraft, we have a new company emerging from stealth that is Eclipse Space. There's not a whole lot to know about this company. They announced the emergence from stealth without a funding round attached to it, which is pretty rare. But most of it seems centered around their background, being that their founding team has a history with Starlink development. And from the renders that they showed in the announcement, it looks very similar to Starlink. So the obvious play here is they're trying to create a commercial business that is able to manufacture satellites at scale and performance levels of Starlink for anybody that's not SpaceX. This comes at an interesting time. I, I'm interested to get your take on this because I am of mixed mind as of recent on how valuable this sector is. There seems to be indication from most loudly the U.S. government of I feel like early in the year they're like, we don't have the capability to stand up all of the services we want to do. But recently that's shifted to, hey, we've got bus manufacturing figured out. We need more people to actually deploy capabilities and stand up new payloads and actually get this stuff working. And that seems somewhat reflected with all the vertical consolidation we're starting to see, and the same players showing up over and over again in large government contracts. So it seems like a lot of the players, at least for this kind of era of satellite manufacturing, have kind of been picked. And I also see with mega constellations, the trend there is kind of shifting. We've had big players like Starlink, like Amazon Leo, OneWeb. We've got Iris Squared, Telesat Leo, all these large-ish constellations already kind of designed and just going through the development and deployment phase. So I don't know of many constellations that are still looking for a bus provider at this stage, and I don't think that the next phase of satellite development is going to trend towards mega constellations. It seems like it's very much trending more towards MEO, where you need fewer satellites, or VLEO, which is just a drastically different kind of bus. So I don't know. I find it hard to believe there's a huge market out there for a company like Eclipse Space to pursue. I think if they were 2-3 years earlier, there would be more business for them to be had. But I would say that the one thing is that if they can achieve Starlink level of performance, I still don't think there's many manufacturers out there that are able to do that so cost effectively as SpaceX has been able to, because it's $250,000 per satellite. And even the best manufacturers amongst commercial operators are at still at the millions of dollars per satellite. So if they're able to cost effectively compete, they could be able to take some of these contracts away.
There's very little, I'll say, novel capability that they are bringing to the market. What they are bringing to the market is a lot of cost efficiency. So what they're offering is primarily better sort of manufacturing at scale, better and all of that is sort of underwritten and is underpinned by better sort of manufacturing practices and capabilities. So I'm not trying to denigrate what Eclipse's core competencies are, or what they're bringing to the table. But to your point, broadly speaking, hey, if we need to get a bus, if we need to get a satellite, if we need to get an asset on orbit, we can do so. Yeah. So bus manufacturing is a solved problem. The first, 80% of that problem has been solved. Now, to your point, the 4x, 5x, 10x price point difference between what SpaceX is able to do and what the rest of the industry is able to achieve, that is a massive market opportunity. So if they're able to come in and let's just throw a dart and say they're able to hit $500,000 per satellite with their manufacturing capabilities, that in and of itself is really meaningful. So whether or not they're actually going to be going out and winning some of these government contracts, whether they're going to be I'll say eating directly, or whether they're more sort of selling picks and shovels in this gold rush, I would describe them more as a picks and shovels salesperson. Hey, you're left-handed, great, I got a left-handed shovel for you. I think that's sort of more where they would fit into the ecosystem, being able to provide a much more competitive price point because of their scale and their ability to develop and manufacture at scale. But basically they've come out of stealth less than a week ago. It's very unclear as to how much what any sort of numbers are. This is all sort of hypothetical promises and opportunities, right? It's very unclear what this sort of value add will actually wind up looking like. And so, okay, great, you're able to, and then if we talk about the numbers, okay, great, you're able to provide a satellite for, at cost to SpaceX, marginal cost for a satellite, $250,000. So if they're able to achieve marginal cost to themselves of $500,000, okay, so like what margin do they need, and how much does that actually move the needle here? If their margin needs to be 40%, then they'd be looking at, right, like basically a satellite closer to like $750,000 or $800,000. They'd be looking at a satellite that rounds up to about $1 million. And if folks are sort of independently on their own hitting like $1 million and a half dollars per satellite, then that's meaningful, but it's not enough necessarily for me to want to completely change my entire manufacturing supply in order to get there. So, the upside is massive. The actual sort of reality of the execution will totally depend on what they're able to do and what sort of scale and price point they're able to achieve. But there's despite the fact that we can already do this, there's no reason to believe that being able to do this an order of magnitude better is not going to be a massive hit. Moving on to infrastructure, first and foremost, Starfish Space has completed their long-range rendezvous with Gilmour Space Technologies' ALARASat. So the OtterPup 2 successfully utilized their autonomous guidance and navigation software to close and hold distance of their target to right about 10 kilometers. So this is really impressive. Like we've seen RPO capabilities demonstrated previously, but Starfish is somebody who's been working on this for a while. So it's great to see them getting the long range rendezvous. Next stages will include, I believe, even closer proximity imaging and reconnaissance, and I think they might also have a docking plan scheduled with this vehicle. So really big day for Starfish Space. Congratulations to them and to the team. There's a lot of capabilities that 10 kilometers of proximity are able to provide, especially if you're able to achieve that level of proximity without the knowledge or participation or contribution of the target party. So it'll be interesting to see what this sort of demonstrated ability opens up as far as products and services and market opportunities.
Yeah, I love to see new news come out of Starfish Space. They're one of the most impressive companies out there, especially for the size they are. They had OtterPup 1 that already impressed me because it was a failure on the part of the deployment, but they recovered beautifully. We had the Starfish Remora mission that was on the Impulse Space Mira spacecraft earlier this year, and they were able to maneuver the spacecraft to within a kilometer of another spacecraft. And this was particularly impressive because they were feeding the telemetry data to the Impulse spacecraft and allowing it to do the maneuvering, which is a pretty unique offering. And it allows their core technology to be transplantable onto any spacecraft, which is basically what they've been demonstrating over these missions. OtterPup 1 was with Launcher. The Remora mission was with Impulse. This OtterPup 2 mission is their own spacecraft, but they were originally partnered with D-Orbit to be the target spacecraft. I also find it interesting they're able to use different camera systems and components. Like OtterPup 2, they get their cameras from Redwire, the Argus cameras. They also get like propulsion from ThrustMe and the gripper from Honeybee Robotics. So it's a consortium of different products in one spacecraft, which I think just goes to their ability to like integrate multiple different suppliers and partners and manufacturers. Like they have a huge ecosystem of customers they're working with, which is impressive just because integration is hard. Integration for an RPO platform is even harder. But I think for the Remora mission, they're using the TRL-11. So all that to say, they are showing incredible capability with a variety of different mission profiles for a pretty cutting edge application, which is capture. The OtterPup 2 is at risk of kind of not finishing because D-Orbit pulled out as the target satellite. I guess they didn't want to be grabbed by Starfish. And so within a few months, like Starfish found Gilmour Sat's ALARASat as a new target. So just going to show their resiliency yet again. of being able to recover from mission setbacks. And I'm really excited to see how they do. I think Catalyst Space and Starfish Space are two of the companies I love watching the most, just accomplishing crazy things with RPO technology. And this OtterPup 2 should be an actual capture maneuver. So with Remora, they were able to show they can get in close proximity, which itself is an accomplishment. With OtterPup 2, they'll actually grab a LARSat and demonstrate full RPO capability, which very few companies can do. I mean, Astroscale is one of the other ones that's kind of shown promise with this. So they are in rarefied air. And this accomplishment will be huge.
I mean, speaking of Astroscale, they announced a $190 million raise. Well, first off, they reported $71 million in revenue. Well, I guess more technically in project income, which represents a double from their numbers in 2025. So they doubled their year-over-year income. They're still operating at a net loss, but they cut that net loss from 2025 roughly in half. And so they're on track to, hold net operating loss basically steady while growing revenues by 25 to sort of 50% this upcoming year. So they've been doing very well. And to your point, they are one of the few companies that has demonstrated RPO products and services, RPO capabilities. They've done a refueling mission, I believe, for the U.S. Space Force and an end-of-life deorbit mission for the UK. I might have those two mixed up. It might have been a deorbit mission for the U.S. Space Force, but regardless, they've done multiple docking required missions, both of which were with consenting and or cooperating target satellites. But this is the magnitude of the technological achievement necessary to accomplish that shouldn't be understated. So Astroscale, no surprise at all that they've been able to raise a very lucrative round off the back of some really great financial performance, some strong financial growth, and a continued technical excellence and technical moat.
Yeah, I think where I've been really impressed with Starfish on their technical capability, I've been really impressed with Astroscale on their business capability. I mean, obviously there's a lot of technical skill involved with what they do, but to me, I keep getting impressed by the variety of contracts they get. RPO we talk about as one monolithic capability, but it enables a whole breadth of different space profiles. So we've got in-space assembly and manufacturing. We've got docking and berthing with habitats. We've got, repair and life extension of vehicles. We have debris removal. Like there's a whole host of things that giving robotic autonomous capability of spacecraft unlocks. I think both Starfish and Astroscale have been at the forefront of pushing that forward. I think Catalyst might join them very soon, but Astroscale is just like you said, they've got the Address J, they've got the ELSA-M missions. Those are going concurrently, which to me, this is what's impressive. Is like they have some track record of accomplishments on orbit, but a lot of their programs are like concurrently ongoing. So they just keep adding to this portfolio of different missions they have. They had the SkySat J Perfect, JSAT Sky Perfect partnership last month, which is for geo life extension. The Address J Alpha M, those are like debris removal and maneuvering of other spacecraft. And this is all for a relatively young Japanese company that opened up their offices in Europe and expanded there and have a lot of great relationships with Europe as well. And so oftentimes we see a lot of European countries expanding into Asia, or US countries expanding into Asia. Japan has a great history of space exploration, but their commercial strength, I think, is still growing. I think Astroscale is kind of a model to replicate for a lot of Japanese business in the space industry. And, they're doing very well at building these relationships with other regions to enable really advanced technology.
Yeah, I think what impresses me the most about Astroscale's growth and continued contract wins is how diverse to your point, how diverse not only the types of missions that they've been awarded and have been executing on successfully, but also the the diversity sort of in geography as well. Like they are a Japanese company that has won contracts both in the US and in Europe and in the UK and in Japan. Like they've won contracts on a global level that we've seen bigger and more mature, longer tenured companies have difficulty replicating as well. So granted, like some big contributor to this is the fact that they are so cutting edge as far as RPO capabilities go. So like if you want somebody who can do anything in the entirety of the of lexicon, the entirety of the monolithic RPO lexicon, if you want anybody to sort of lead that, one of your first calls is going to be Astroscale. So that obviously makes knocking on any doors a little bit less daunting and a little bit easier, but it's still very impressive to see them get through all of the sort of regulatory and limiting challenges that so many of these companies experience in expanding to other markets or internationally, especially for defense and space purposes, and to just continue to win and execute. Back home, Boeing was awarded a $2 billion Air Force contract for the MUOS Satellite Life Extension Phase 2. The contract award covers 2 satellites, launch support, and on-orbit testing services through 2035, based out of their El Segundo office. So for those of us who don't remember, the MUOS satellite constellation is basically the military satellite communication systems. They are based on, I believe, 3rd generation. So been around for a little while, satellite architecture. And so Lockheed Martin and Boeing have both been awarded contracts over the last several years to service, maintain, and extend the operating life and capability of this military asset.
Yeah, it's a interesting shakeup with the U.S. government award of this contract. It had been getting awarded mainly to Lockheed Martin, but for Lockheed Martin, it's like you win some, you lose some. They got that Raytheon contract for the GPS satellites, and they've been raking in the dough from that. I think it's like 500 mil at a time to launch up pairs of GPS satellites. But then they go and lose this MUOS contract to Boeing. I looked at it, I was like, holy crud, like $1 billion per satellite. That's insane. Like, that's the really high price tag. Granted, they're very big and ultra high frequency satellites, so they're going to be expensive. But it looks like the breakdown is like 900 million to research and development, and the rest is to actually building it. So like, I was like, okay, maybe that's the only more insane thing you could tell me is like, you're just gonna give them a blank check for 900 million to develop something that they've already basically built. Like the payload is maybe the unique thing. The platform's already like you said, 3rd generation. Like they've developed this thing. So big win for Boeing. I feel like it's a little bit of it's a little overpaid by the government, but what else is new? I thought it was also kind of funny given that, they just awarded like 500 million for MilTech Satcom stuff to Viasat and SES, both of whom use Boeing as their manufacturer. So Viasat VS3, the 3 geocom satellites that just went up, as well as SES mPOWER MEO constellation, like 28 satellites, both are based on Boeing buses. But when they were selected for MilTech Satcom, they went with K2 Space and Rocket Lab. So an obvious snub to Boeing. They're like, we are getting out of this stalwart prime bus game and backing the little guys, quote unquote little guys. I feel like they're the winners of like the past 2 generations of space industry.
Small independent gaming company.
Yeah, but it's an interesting. It's kind of interesting because it's like the government is the one buying Boeing's stuff versus before it was like commercial partners buying stuff. And it's kind of an odd like inversion of the maturation of space industry. Like typically we see government money being spent to stand up a capability, and then the commercial industry kind of grows from there. It seems kind of backwards for Boeing. They're getting exited from some commercial partnerships while their government contracts grow. But in the end, like these commercial partners are also getting government contracts as well. So it really maybe it's just like a sign of the times we're in right now, which is just government money is flowing everywhere, and everybody's getting billions of dollars.
Yeah, well, I mean, the $900 million R&D price point. I think it's fair to say that that Boeing should definitely be back in the development game. If they're going to be executing on these 2 satellites, and the price point is going to be $1 billion per, with the vast majority of that going towards the research, fundamentals, engineering, and development necessary to actually stand up something novel. Like I cannot imagine that that this actually strays too far from that sort of traditional pattern of the government standing up something novel, standing up new capability, and then the commercial market sort of reaping the benefits of that longer term. So I would imagine that a lot of what Boeing is going to be working on is going to have to be pretty novel, especially because it's a 10-year timeline. Well, I guess not fully 10-year, but through 2035. So forever and a day. We're talking about upwards of 200 million a year going towards the research and development of new space assets. So if that's the price point that we're at currently of $1 billion for a novel satellite, I think that there's going to be plenty of room for Eclipse Space to really knock it out of the park.
Yeah. Maybe they'll like discover a new form of light or something. Maybe there's some frequencies that haven't been found yet.
Moving a little bit further north than El Segundo, California, MDA was awarded a Canadian SAR satellite contract as part of Canada's RadarSat program. So MDA will supply an advanced SAR satellite that's going to operate alongside the existing RadarSat mission satellites. This expands upon roughly 50 million in awards granted back in December for the procurement of some long lead components. So they want a follow-up contract to actually build and execute on the satellite after they got sort of that Kickstarter money effectively to go out and buy the most expensive bits that they would need. And this contract also includes launch and servicing, launch services and enhancement to the ground segments and data security segments supporting the mission. So very much Canada finding ways to deploy capital directly to the entirety of the space industry there, standing up end-to-end sovereign capability. This also plays in with sort of MDA's acquisition of Blue Canyon Technologies that we spoke about last week. MDA has clearly been very successful in Canada, and they are clearly trying to replicate that success here in the States. Now, I don't think they're expecting to achieve nearly the same sort of market share in the US as they have in Canada, but I'm willing to bet that they're pretty darn confident that they'll be able to get a couple of contracts here. And so we spoke about this initially last week, and we can talk a little bit more about it today. But a lot of that is going to wind up hinging on how their acquisition of Blue Canyon Technologies goes. Whether they're acquiring Blue Canyon Technologies for the engineering capabilities, whether they're acquiring them for the BCT's business or government relations capabilities. Or whether they are acquiring them effectively for just to sort of have a as stood up and already established U.S. presence, whether effectively they're trying to acquire BCT for heritage. All three of those different justifications for the acquisition will sort of impact how they proceed in trying to win and execute on U.S. government contracts. But the fact that they've been able to continue to win and execute on those contracts in Canada bodes well. But it's we're still comparing apples and oranges here a little bit in terms of executing in sort of different government customers. Astroscale's international success is not the norm.
I mean, it's something new for MDA. They've already done 2 radar sats. It is odd that they're renewing it so quickly because they're only like 5 years old now. But I'm guessing there's a long enough lead time that they need to get started now. Although still odd because there can't be that much enhancement to it. So it should just like be a reprint of the previous 2. Hopefully cheaper though, because those last 2 radar sats were like $1 billion each. So even more expensive than those MEO satellites for Boeing, which is impressive for Canada because they don't typically spend that much on satellites. But that's a good sign that they were very capable. They're one of the earliest synthetic aperture radar satellites up there. So great capability for Canada. I'm sure there's some interest from some of their partners over in Europe, seeing as how excited they are for SAR, and a big win for MDA. I don't know. They've been kind of on a tear recently, and this just furthers that.
I don't want to sort of beat a dead horse or keep harping on their acquisition of Blue Canyon Technologies, but I mean, so they bought BCT in large part because of BCT's component manufacturing specialization and their expertise with momentum wheels. And this week, Umbra, who initially announced that they would start selling their proprietary hardware to the public markets, released tear sheets and started selling reaction wheels and momentum wheels themselves. So this is the first set of hardware that Umbra is now selling for public consumption. And MDA now potentially has the ability to acquire the same sort of components and the same sort of expertise that they would. Like, they can now literally just buy the hardware themselves. They no longer necessarily need to build it themselves. So I'm willing to bet that that MDA following through with this acquisition would indicate that the acquisition of Blue Canyon Technologies was about more than just the hardware components and more than just the assets that they've been able to provide. But this is a really interesting signal from Umbra. SAR has been growing globally massively. However, here stateside, SAR has not really been that much of a priority. The demand domestically for synthetic aperture radar assets and data has sort of stagnated, and it has moved fairly slowly. So, it's interesting to see that Umbra is sort of pursuing other revenue options, that they're effectively trying to find other ways to generate money, because they are a top-notch SAR satellite provider. They do the whole soup to nuts solution here. And one would think that if things are moving well and are going smoothly, that they wouldn't need to start selling their own sort of subsystems or components here. But there's probably a lot of signals as to sort of why that's a challenge. But again, Astroscale is the exception, not the rule. So Umbra very, very well could have run into a lot of difficulty in getting to some of the more SAR craving markets internationally, and could have just found themselves having difficulty leveraging on some of that demand. Additionally, they've gotten a couple of good contracts, so this could be completely independent of any sort of cash flow needs. They could be flowing cash very well and just want to supplement that with an additional revenue stream, and could very well not be experiencing any sort of demand shortage here in their target market.
That could be true. I just it's very weird for a SAR, it's very weird for any specialized space application company to pivot into component supplier, which is what they did last August. But this is the first time that I've seen them actually release the details of any of the hardware they intend to sell. So I kind of expect there to be more that they're releasing. I honestly, I could see them doing some of their radio subcomponents and that having more value. SAR is fairly unique in the sense that you need pretty high stability and accuracy when it comes to your ADC, your attitude determination control system. And so maybe there's some special sauce in their wheels, but from their spec sheet, it doesn't seem all that out of spec. Like it's pretty small. It's a 250 millinewton meter max torque, which you're not going to be moving real fast, and it's a 2 newton meter second momentum at max RPM, which is a little big. It's still on like the small satellite kind of side of things. So it's definitely tailored more towards like a constellation style spacecraft. So maybe they're seeing some potential revenue from that system. And I don't know. It's odd to me. Like maybe if they're planning to expand their offerings, it just seems so far out of spec of like what SAR companies typically, like all the SAR companies we talk about, they branch into like intelligence layers and like data gathering and marketplaces. And like with Planet, we've been Planet and Black Sky and Satellogic have all been doing like sovereign satellite sales. So they're selling their whole satellite solution to another company or another country. Mm-hmm. That seems to be where a lot of the big companies think there is revenue to be made. But Umbra is going a level lower and saying we're going to sell the parts, which, yeah, quite an odd move to make. I can't think of many analogs in other companies that have taken this approach. So it's hard to say whether this will pay off or not.
Additionally, out of the US, the first sort of, I'll say, live test, the first live intercept test of Golden Dome's missile defense system was conducted this week. The DDAD, the Dynamic Defense Autonomous Defeat Systems, which deploy directed energy weapons to intercept targets, were successfully tested this week. If our audience will not recall. To remind our audience, a massive amount of the Tranche 3 for the PWSA, a massive amount, 100% of them, were mandated to require effectively. Now, Harrison, refresh my memory on the specific name of the defensive hardware and capabilities, but effectively, they were mandated to include components and subsystems, modules that would protect directly against directed energy weaponry.
Yeah, so they're mandated to include the Starlight system that GOST manufactured, which was then later acquired by Rocket Lab. So we made a big deal of this when that was announced because it effectively allowed Rocket Lab to profit off of all their competitors in that tranche and kind of kicked off a wave of acquisitions that we've been following for the past 6 months or so. It was interesting to hear that because up until that point, I had not heard of any effort to combat directed energy weapons. It's kind of something that's always been around, but never really talked about in the scope of space. There are airplanes that carry giant chemical vats that can use lasers to shoot down rockets, and those have been around since the 90s. There's been research from JAXA of using lasers to deorbit debris, but they were talking about like petawatts of energy, which is approximately the scale that those airplanes generate, but in like massive bursts of just chemical energy generation. So, yeah, I was debating on including this week because it doesn't seem like a space-specific capability, because I don't see how they could have deployed something that does directed energy attack to space. This is likely a ground component, but it is part of the Golden Dome initiative, which is a large defense contract mechanism that we've been following very closely in the space industry because a lot of the Golden Dome is space-based. We've talked about the PWSA a lot. That's under the Space Defense Agency that's being dissolved into other branches of Department of Defense. But it was a precursor to a lot of the capability that Golden Dome is going to rely on, specifically on the control and command sector of things, where it detects missiles and then it commands systems to intercept those missiles. We saw the other side of that equation starting to be funded last month when Golden Dome awarded, was like $3 billion to a few companies to build space-based interceptors. at the time, and kind of leading up to that since late last year, since this conversation about space-based interceptors has started, that seemed like a crazy way to stop missiles. More traditionally, you would just launch a missile from the ground to intercept these other missiles. But with the advent of hypersonics, that becomes a less and less viable option to stopping adversarial attacks. Directed energy weapons, as crazy as it also sounds, is actually one of the most feasible. You can intercept at the speed of light. Hypersonics can't overcome that. The challenges are just where you're going to deploy it. But, with the test that was announced by the Department of Defense this week, it seems they figured that out, and it is now a component of the Golden Dome. So, very interesting development. I highly doubt that this is going to become a space-based capability, but it is something that is going to become a new threat vector for space assets, as we saw with PWSA Tranche 3 and the Starlight system, and as we're now hearing with the test of this capability by the U.S., almost definitely signals that other countries have this capability if we're putting defensive measures on our spacecraft to protect against it.
So first up in the lightning round here, OHB began a $581 million share sale with KKR to fund their expansion and acquisition efforts and to support Rocket Factory Augsburg. So OHB owns a 65% stake in RFA, which is clearly a motivating factor for some of this public raise that they're doing.
Just a little ownership, just a little bit,
just a smidge. And KKR themselves owns over a quarter of OHB. They own, I think, 28.6%. So they're looking at issuing, if you do the napkin math, you're going to get about 1.2 million new shares at the current closing price of like 410 euros to raise the target capital. And so, they made the announcement. Share price dropped by, I believe, like 10%. The share price dropped a little bit after they made the announcement. I'm gonna ballpark it at about 10%. But OHB's stock price has basically tripled in the last 3 months. Over than tripled. Like it's more than tripled over the last 12 months. So I don't think OHB is too worried about taking a little bit off the top in order to raise over $500 million to execute on their goals here. But the raise is being led by KKR. That's who they're going through with the public sale for the share sale. So big move out of Germany as the OKR continues to sort of grow and grow and develop their defense capabilities.
Interesting timing with ISAR getting going on their launches. It looks like RFA is building up some funding to kind of compete or keep pace, at least.
I don't know. I think ISAR, or I think RFA has a lot of ground to make up. I mean, it's not everybody can reach their second launch 4 times.
It's a lot of money, especially compared to like ISAR's 250 million, somewhere around there. And Gilmore Space got the same amount, somewhere around 250 million. So for OHB to raise like close to 600 million, quite a large number, but it's not all for RFA. So not apples to apples. Actually, you know what? I'm going to make a call. They're going to get a Bundeswehr contract in the next month. They almost always go hand in hand, like raises of this number and a defense contract.
I wouldn't be surprised by that at all. I think that's a good call. Axios reported earlier this week that Muon Space has begun to pursue a $250 million round of capital. This comes off the back of their Condor Ultra announcement that they would be creating a new satellite platform with 100 kilowatt of power potential earlier this month. And it comes almost immediately off of the opening of their new 130,000 square foot production facility in San Jose.
I think it's a great move by Muon. Like they've been executing and they have a great backlog of business. So it's kind of weird that they would raise money, but given the environment right now, if they're going to raise money, they should now. And I would I would count on them to be one of the big names for kind of this current wave of space companies, given their track record and their rate of growth. And their kind of purpose is like a contract house for missions. And if they're pivoting more towards this orbital data center, seeing a market for that, I think the money will help get them there and be competitive. And if they keep executing the way they have, I think they'll this funding combined with their revenue will help them grow immensely in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think this is, a $250 million round of capital is going to allow Muon to not only execute on their backlog, not only continue to grow their capabilities, but I think more importantly, position themselves for where they think the puck is going and where the industry very clearly thinks the puck is going for these high-powered buses, high-powered capabilities. So them making the announcement and pursuing the raise in the current sort of frothy market, I think the likelihood that this ends well for Muon Space is very high. There's always the risk of downside in sort of any fundraise, in any investment, in any sort of opportunity, but this just makes a lot of sense. I agree with you. Additionally, out on the East Coast, Symphony Space has closed an oversubscribed pre-seed round led by Female Founders Fund. They are building an orbital, effectively what amounts to an orbital port or orbital space station with some robotic arm capabilities that are able to deploy, remove, and swap out modular payload systems that all sort of attach to the same central bus or core bus platform. The capabilities that they're designing for include up to, I believe, 1,200 kilograms of total payload that they can support. And this comes off of the back of sort of an explicit announcement that the U.S. is actually sort of investigating or pursuing. I believe the term is pre-deployed assets. In so many words, something that is sort of launched preemptively that would then be able to repair or replace or supplement an asset that experiences challenges on orbit. Moving even further east, Spanish startup FASA has raised $10.5 million to fund their international expansion and global deployment of their sovereign satellite capabilities. The round is led by Kibo Ventures and has emboldened the round is led by Kibo Ventures, and the company, emboldened by their 25 current satellites in orbit, are shooting for a constellation target of 120 satellites over the next several years. And the founder, the CEO and co-founders stated goals for the company. Julian Fernandez has stated that they're aiming to help establish FASA as a European benchmark in sovereign space infrastructure.
Yeah, so FASA, a really impressive company. Worked with them a couple of times. They're a very talented team, and they've been building out their capabilities for the past few years. So 25 satellites, that's pretty big for a company their size. I feel like they're worth mentioning this week because Spanish space technology has continued to be impressive. We talked to Open Cosmos a couple months ago. Just talking to them was blown away by what they're able to accomplish. We have companies like PLD Space out of Spain being one of the only rocket companies being developed out of the EU and making great progress. And I just, oftentimes you talk about like Italy, France, Germany being the big players in the European space industry, but Spain has continuously punched above their weight class. And I think seeing another company like FASA succeeding in this way and setting their sights high, 140 satellites, it's impressive because I think I read a lot of these announcements. It's like, oh, we're going to launch thousands of satellites, and they always seem so like spectacular.
Fantastical.
Yeah, it's like, okay, call me when you get to half that, Amazon. but there's so many other companies that do amazing things like Spire and Tomorrow and Black Sky, like the big companies, but they operate with this fleet that's a fraction of that, like hundreds of satellites. So I find it like really impressive when a company finds a niche that they're able to focus on, carve out a very realistic number and actually achieve that, and then are able to dominate off the back of that. And down the line they can expand, but I think FOSSA is one of those, much like Hubble Networks or OQ Technologies, where they find like kind of a business use case for technology or for communications constellations, and they just work towards that. And I think this is a great step on that path.
Yeah, I really like your comparison to Open Cosmos. I see a lot of similarities between the two companies myself. Most impressively, and I think most importantly, is sort of the I'll say the pragmatism and the humility with which they've focused on sort of their core product, their beachhead market, and their first customers. They're not going out and promising to launch a 100,000 unit constellation to provide 10 gigawatts of orbital compute. They're just launching assets and providing telecommunication services to their customers. They're just selling what the customers they are servicing need, and they're doing that and growing and continuing to execute well. So congratulations to the team, and I'm sure they'll be able to take that I believe it was 9.1 million euros in funding, but they're going to be able to take that capital and just run with it.
Yeah. For the tech advances this week, we have a pretty big one coming out of Starlink. It might seem kind of small, an announcement, because it's a direct-to-mobile service plan announcement, which any of our listeners can be like, well, they already have that. It's called Starlink. And yes, that is true, but it is a kind of expansion upon what Starlink is. There's plenty of Starlinks that do direct-to-device, but despite the fact that their satellite can talk to a phone, there's still somehow a middleman in there in the form of telecom providers. So think Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile. This has been an ongoing kind of tension point between, primarily Starlink. I was going to say communications constellations, but there's really only Starlink right now. AST SpaceMobile is kind of, deploying as well. But really it's been a fight that's being borne out between Starlink and some of these big stalwart telecom providers. I've often looked at it as the more the telecom providers get involved in space, the more mature space is as an infrastructural industry. And that's something we saw a couple months ago when AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, they formed a consortium to kind of take more control over the infrastructure layer that sits in space, given that they own the infrastructure that's on the Earth. They own the radio towers, the wires, the antennas, all the ground infrastructure. They want to expand that to space. Going the opposite direction, SpaceX wants to own more of the customer base that they are servicing. So during the IPO roadshow, Glenn Shotwell let it slip that SpaceX is looking at kind of going into that telecom provider service. So they would become a telecom provider like Verizon or T-Mobile, where they would sell a mobile plan directly to the consumer and manage that operation and take a chunk of that pie as well. There's some technical things there, like, can Starlink really cover the entire globe? Can they provide coverage at the same extent that companies like Verizon or T-Mobile can with just satellites, because they don't have these ground infrastructures? And that's yet to be seen. But if they can, then they are taking on a multi-trillion-dollar industry. I think it's like $3 trillion between all of the telecom providers, which could help justify their large price tag of their stock. The speculation is that they're targeting potentially acquiring one of the telecom providers instead of standing up their own mobile system on their own. They had previously talked about making their own mobile phone, so it is still possible that they do this from scratch. But acquiring one of the customers could make a lot of sense. T-Mobile's the obvious one because they're partnered with them already. The downside is that T-Mobile has some of the lowest amount of ground infrastructure among the telecom providers, so it wouldn't really add much for them other than the users that are already on T-Mobile. Well, that could make sense if they're planning to use their satellites as the entire infrastructure. They don't want that ground infrastructure. But the other one that makes sense would be Verizon. I think it would be a lot harder of an acquisition target, but given the price of SpaceX, it's not impossible. They could just hostile take over a company like Verizon. Verizon having a lot of ground infrastructure that could help fill in their gaps, a large customer base. They're one of the biggest telecom providers out there, as well as taking away Amazon's key customer, since they're partnered with Verizon through the the Global Star deal that they did with Apple and Verizon. So I think my bet would be on them taking over Verizon to kind of move further up the chain. But it will be interesting to see if all these telecom providers band together to try to prevent that from happening, because that seems to be the way they're going in anticipation.
I would fully expect the telecom providers to join together in order to prevent one of them from being taken over by a company that has traditionally served as one of their suppliers.
Yeah,
because if one of them can be bought out and eaten by a supplier, then all of them and the entire layer that they dominate and own is completely at risk. So I would imagine that they're going to fight tooth and nail to prevent that from happening in whatever capacity they can.
Yeah. I think T-Mobile has a natural defense mechanism in there, and that they're owned by Deutsche Telekom. And we've seen how defensive Germany is about Americans buying their companies. So that might make that impossible already. But given that they're a publicly traded company, it's totally possible with the amount of war chest that SpaceX has that they could still acquire them. But they're also like, there's a downside of they can't merge. Like, they're going to get trust busted. They'll be too much of a monopoly. So they're all kind of, it'll be interesting to see what they do if they try to resist being taken over by SpaceX, because they don't have a lot of options to go off of.
It'll be interesting if and when SpaceX is able to take over one of these companies, and all of these companies banding together, like, oh, that'll be trust busted. That's antitrust. This is a clearly sort of monopolistic layer. But SpaceX, a company larger than all of them, acquiring any or all of their capabilities, like, no, we're not worried about that getting trust busted in any capacity.
Exactly.
It's like a funny dichotomy.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I'm like. Oh, that's so weird. And lastly for today, we have Orbital Composites winning a $1.9 million TACFI from SpaceWorks. So that's the research branch of the Space Force. TACFIs are funding mechanisms to help get some key technology off the ground. Orbital Composites is a company that works on developing composite structures for kind of high stress situations, particularly rocketry. So this TACFI is specifically for a composite rocket nozzle that's able to survive 3,000 degrees Celsius and a lot of thermal cycling. So this is it's hitting on a key trend, which is that the U.S. manufacturing ecosystem is grossly underprepared to handle highly dynamic, high-scale production of key defense technologies. And I think seeing this kind of contract coming from SpaceWorks just highlights that government's very aware of that. They're willing to spend money to help change that. I think U.S. rocketry is one of those things that we've seen across the defense industry and the space industry needing a boost in funding and development capabilities. So seeing a company like Orbital Composites combine AI and robotics to develop a rapid manufacturing capability for some critical components is great to see. That's a wrap for this week's recap of the space industry. We hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, please drop us a comment, check out our socials, and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Substack, or wherever you're receiving this signal. Until next time, this is Harrison Lambert and Paul Mayer signing off for now.